It was a Tuesday evening in November when I heard the knock at my door. Not a confident knock. Not the kind of knock that announces good news or an expected guest. It was the kind of knock that a person makes when they've been standing outside for several minutes working up the courage to use their hand at all. Hesitant, small, almost apologetic. I had just set my tea on the coffee table when I heard it. I wasn't expecting anyone. My daughter knew I went to bed early these days, and we had spoken just that morning about nothing in particular, the weather, a book I was reading, whether she thought her son might like the sweater I'd knitted him for Christmas. It was a normal conversation. Nothing that would explain why, when I opened my front door at 9:43 on a Tuesday night, she was standing on my porch in the rain. She was holding my grandson with both arms, his head pressed against her shoulder, already asleep despite the cold. A duffel bag hung from her elbow. 2 large suitcases sat on the porch behind her, their wheels dark with rainwater. Her hair was soaked flat against her forehead, and she wasn't wearing a coat, only the cardigan she'd probably had on since morning. She looked at me the way she used to look at me when she was 9 years old and had broken something she wasn't supposed to touch. Like she was already bracing for a reaction she deserved. I didn't say a single word. I stepped back, opened the door all the way, and held out my arms for my grandson. She handed him to me and I carried him to the guest room and laid him on the bed and covered him with the quilt my own mother had made. And by the time I came back to the living room, my daughter was sitting on the couch with her hands folded in her lap, staring at the floor. The duffel bag was at her feet. She had left the suitcases on the porch. I sat down across from her. I waited. She said, "I didn't know where else to go." I said, "You never need a reason to come here. You know that." She nodded but didn't look up. A few seconds passed. Then she said, "She changed the locks." I kept my face still. "Your mother-in-law changed the locks. On our house." She finally looked at me. Her eyes were dry, which told me she had already cried everything out before she got here. What was left was just exhaustion. And something underneath the exhaustion that looked a lot like shame. My husband let her do it. He was there. He just stood there while the locksmith worked and he didn't say anything to me. She stopped, pressed her lips together. He handed her the new key. I picked up my tea. It had gone cold, but I held it anyway. Her name is Sophie. She is 34 years old. She has her father's eyes and my stubbornness, and a laugh that fills up whatever room she's in. She works as a structural engineer, and she is very good at her job, which is something I say not as a proud mother but as a simple statement of fact. Sophie does not do things halfway. She never has. When she was 12, she decided she wanted to learn piano, and within 8 months, she was playing pieces that her teacher said took most students 3 years. When she met her husband David at 28, she decided he was the one she wanted, and she pursued that with the same quiet certainty she brought to everything else. I had concerns about David from the beginning, not about David himself. Exactly, he was pleasant enough, reasonably intelligent, the kind of man who remembers to open doors and say thank you and make a good impression at dinner. My concern was about what David came attached to. His mother's name is Gloria. I had met Gloria exactly 4 times before Sophie's wedding. Each time, she had found a way within the first 10 minutes to mention the square footage of her house, the country club where she and her husband held membership, and the fact that her side of the family had been in this county for 4 generations. She said these things conversationally, pleasantly, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She said them the way some people state the weather as simple facts that everyone in the room should be grateful to know. At the wedding rehearsal dinner, Gloria had pulled me aside and said, in the most gracious possible tone, that she hoped Sophie understood what a wonderful opportunity this marriage represented. I had smiled and said that I hoped David understood the same thing. Gloria had laughed as though I'd made a small, charming joke, and then excused herself to speak to someone more interesting. I had not forgotten that laugh. Sophie stayed with me that night without telling me anything else. I didn't push. I made her a bowl of soup and sat with her while she ate it, and then I told her to sleep. And she did, in the guest room beside her son, and I sat in my kitchen until past midnight drinking cold tea and thinking. In the morning, after my grandson woke up and ate the scrambled eggs, I made him and ran around my backyard in his socks. Sophie told me the rest of it. It had started, she said, about 4 months earlier. David's father had passed away in the spring, and the estate, which was considerable, had gone entirely to Gloria. This was not a surprise. What was a surprise was what Gloria had decided to do with her newfound financial authority. She had, Sophie told me carefully, begun talking to David about money, about assets, about what belonged to whom and what the future should look like. The house where Sophie and David and my grandson had lived for the past 3 years was in Sophie's name. I had made sure of that. When they were looking to buy, I had provided the down payment on the condition that the deed carried Sophie's name as primary owner. David had agreed without complaint at the time. It had seemed like a practical arrangement. Gloria, apparently, had recently decided it was something else entirely. She told David, Sophie said, wrapping both hands around her coffee mug, that a wife holding the house deed above her husband is a form of disrespect, that it signals a power imbalance, that it was my way of holding something over him. She paused. She told him that if he loved her and respected himself, he would have the deed transferred to his name before the end of the year. I set down my coffee cup very carefully, and David agreed with this. Sophie looked out the window at my grandson, who was attempting to catch a squirrel. He said he'd been thinking about it for a while, that he felt emasculated, that he thought I'd done it on purpose to have leverage. Her voice was flat, not angry, just flat, the way a voice gets when it has moved past anger into something quieter and more settled. I told him the house was in my name because my mother put up the money and wanted to protect the investment, that it had nothing to do with him. He said. She stopped again. What did he say? He said Gloria had explained that my mother came from nothing and that this was how people like us operate, quietly, to get what we want. I heard those words and I felt something shift in my chest. Not anger, exactly. Something older than anger. Something that had been waiting patiently for a long time. I want to explain something about myself. I am 63 years old. I was born in a small town in western Pennsylvania to parents who worked hard and asked for very little, and taught me that the most valuable thing a person can own is the ability to wait. My father used to say that a river doesn't fight the rock. It just keeps moving until the rock isn't there anymore. I have carried that with me my entire life. I spent 31 years as a family court judge. I have heard every variety of human ugliness that one family can visit upon another. I have seen people lie under oath with perfect composure. I have seen documents forged so skillfully that experts disagreed about their authenticity. I have seen wealth used as a weapon in ways that would make most people's blood run cold. And in 31 years on the bench, I learned one thing above everything else. Patient people almost always win, because impatient people almost always make mistakes. I had retired 2 years before Sophie's situation began. I had not told my son-in-law what I used to do for a living. Sophie knew, of course. But David and Gloria knew only that I was a retired woman who knitted sweaters and grew tomatoes and apparently came from nothing. I had never corrected that impression. The morning after Sophie arrived at my door, I made a phone call. His name is Richard, and he has been one of my closest friends for 22 years, and he is one of the best real estate attorneys in the state. And when I told him what had happened, he was quiet for a moment and then said, "Tell me everything." I told him everything. He said, "She can't force a deed transfer. The property is Sophie's." "I know that," I said. "What I need to know is whether anything was filed without Sophie's knowledge." There was a pause. "I'll pull the county records today." He called me back that afternoon. His voice, when he spoke, was careful in the way that voices get when the news is worse than expected. He said, "Margaret, there's a transfer on file dated 6 weeks ago. Sophie's signature is on it." I sat very still in my kitchen chair. "She didn't sign it," I said. "I know," he said, "because I'm looking at her actual signature on the original deed, and whoever signed this transfer document has never met Sophie's handwriting in their life." I closed my eyes. Forgery. Of course. Gloria had not waited for David to convince Sophie. Gloria had decided to simply remove Sophie from the equation entirely. I spent the next 3 days being very quiet and very busy. I did not tell Sophie what Richard had found. Not yet. I needed to understand the full shape of what had happened before I let my daughter carry the weight of it. I asked her to stay with me for a while, which she was grateful for, and I watched my grandson build elaborate block towers in my living room and knock them down and laugh. And I thought about rivers and rocks. Richard obtained a copy of the forged document and sent it to a forensic document examiner, a woman I had worked with many times on the bench, whose opinion had held up in court more times than I could count. Her report came back in 11 days. The signature on the transfer document was not Sophie's. The ink composition was inconsistent with Sophie's known writing samples. And the detail that made Richard call me at 7 in the morning to read it aloud, the document had been notarized by a notary whose license had been issued 3 years ago, whose primary place of business was listed as a company that Gloria had founded and currently served as director of. A notary. On Gloria's payroll. Certifying a forged signature on a deed transfer that would have given David and therefore Gloria full ownership of a house that my daughter had paid for with money I had given her. I sat with that for a long time. On a Thursday morning, I drove to the county assessor's office myself. I am a retired woman in her 60s, with white hair and sensible shoes, and I smiled at the young man behind the counter and asked some questions, and he answered them helpfully and completely, because people like me are not threatening, and that is one of the great advantages of being exactly who I appear to be. I confirmed everything Richard had told me. The transfer was on file. The property had been officially reclassified under David's name. Sophie did not know. On the way home, I stopped at the grocery store and bought the ingredients for my grandson's favorite dinner, which is macaroni and cheese with cut-up hot dogs, which I find deeply undignified as a meal, but which makes him laugh with his whole body when it arrives at the table. I made it that evening and watched him eat 3 bowls of it, and thought about my father and the river and the rock. That weekend, David called Sophie's phone. She stepped outside to take it. I could hear her voice through the kitchen window, but not the words. When she came back inside, her face was carefully neutral, and she said, "He wants me to come home. He says it was a misunderstanding. He says his mother was just trying to help organize their finances and it got out of hand." I said, "What do you want to do?" She looked at her son, who was asleep on my couch with my cat curled beside him. "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's okay," I said. "You don't have to decide tonight." She didn't go back. 2 more days passed. David called 3 more times. On the 4th call, according to Sophie, he stopped asking her to come home and started asking about the house, whether she had signed any paperwork recently, whether she had been in contact with anyone about the property. She told him no, she hadn't signed anything. Why was he asking? He said never mind. She told me about the call that evening with a careful look on her face, and I could see her beginning to add things up. I decided it was time. I sat Sophie down at my kitchen table, and I told her what Richard had found and what the examiner had confirmed and what I had verified at the assessor's office. I told her clearly and without softening any of it, because Sophie does not need to be protected from the truth. She needs to be trusted with it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "She forged my signature." "Yes, and David knew." I looked at her. "That's what we need to determine." She nodded slowly. Her jaw was set in the way it gets when she has made a decision. "What do we do?" I said, "Richard is filing to have the transfer voided on the basis of fraud. The forensic report is attached. The county will freeze the property record pending investigation. Gloria's notary is going to have a very uncomfortable conversation with the state licensing board." I paused. "And I have asked Richard to file a separate civil suit for document fraud and property theft." Sophie stared at me. "Mum, how do you know how to do all of this?" I smiled at her. "I told you I was a judge, sweetheart. You just forgot to tell your husband. It took 12 weeks from the day Richard filed for the wheels to complete their turning. Gloria hired an attorney, an expensive one, from a firm downtown that had a very polished website. He was good. He filed motions and counter-motions and submitted an alternative explanation involving a clerical error at the county office. He was confident and well-dressed and argued with great energy. The forensic examiner testified for 40 minutes. Gloria's attorney had no useful response to the ink analysis. The judge, a woman I happened to have served alongside on a state judicial committee for 6 years, though I sat in the gallery and said nothing, voided the fraudulent transfer in its entirety. The property was restored to Sophie's name, where it had always belonged. The notary surrendered her license before the licensing board could revoke it formally. The civil suit for document fraud proceeded on a separate track. David did not contest the voiding of the transfer. His own attorney had apparently advised him, correctly, that there was no position available to him that did not make things significantly worse. I was in the gallery when the ruling came through. Sophie was at the plaintiff's table with Richard beside her. When the judge read the decision, Sophie sat very still for a moment and then reached over and gripped Richard's arm briefly and nodded. She didn't cry. She didn't turn around to look at her mother-in-law. She simply gathered her papers with both hands and stood up straight. "That is my daughter. That is exactly my daughter. Gloria was in the gallery on the other side of the room. I had been aware of her presence for the entire proceeding. She was a striking woman, well-dressed, composed, the kind of woman who had spent decades curating an impression of authority. She had not looked at me once. As people gathered their things to leave, I stood up from my seat and walked toward the aisle. Gloria was doing the same from her side of the gallery. We met, by the precise geometry of the room, at the end of the center row, near the door. She looked at me for the first time. Something moved behind her eyes. Recalibration. I recognized it. The expression of someone revising their understanding of a situation in real time. I said very pleasantly, "Gloria, it was nice to see you." She said nothing for a moment. Then, "You're a judge." "I was," I said. "I'm retired. I just grow tomatoes now." I smiled. "And look after my family." I held the door open for her, and she walked through it, and I followed, and that was the last conversation we have had. Sophie did not go back to David. That is her decision, and it belongs entirely to her, and I have never offered an opinion on it, except to say that whatever she chooses, I am here. They are working through the legal arrangements for my grandson through attorneys, and it is not simple, and it is not fast, but it is moving in the direction of something stable. My grandson is with me 3 days a week while Sophie works. He has learned to tell the difference between the good squirrels, who come to the feeder, and the bad squirrels, who tip it over, and he has strong feelings about both. He calls me grandma and says it approximately 40 times per day, and I have never once gotten tired of hearing it. I think about what Gloria said, that first time at the rehearsal dinner, that she hoped Sophie understood what a wonderful opportunity this marriage represented. I think about how certain she was of the shape of things, of who held power and who didn't, of what my daughter was worth and where I fit in the picture. I don't carry anger about it. I never have. Anger is weight you carry for someone else's benefit, and I learned a long time ago to put it down. What I carry instead is this: the knowledge that patience is its own kind of power, that the people who underestimate quiet women are usually the ones who end up surprised, that a river doesn't fight the rock. Sophie called me last week on a Tuesday evening, and we talked for an hour about nothing in particular, a project she was designing at work, a book I'd recommended, whether my grandson was old enough yet to start learning piano. It was an ordinary conversation between a mother and her daughter, the kind of conversation I hope we have for the rest of my life. When she was about to hang up, she said, "Mum, thank you for all of it." I said, "You never need to thank me for that." She said, "I know, but I wanted to." After we hung up, I sat for a while in the kitchen with my tea and the cat on my lap, and outside the window the yard was dark and the November wind was moving through the oak trees, and everything was quiet and exactly where it belonged. That is enough. That has always been enough.